Ever since the Israeli war in Gaza began, there have been a lot of countries who have gradually begun to abandon support for Israel and then actively oppose what Israel is doing and denouncing it. That's the reason the United States so often has to isolate itself from the rest of the world at the UN in order to shield Israel from denunciations or other kinds of penalties. One of the countries that stood up almost immediately when that bombing began, when a lot of other countries were afraid to do anything or say anything against Israel, was the government of South Africa. And eventually that opposition to what the Israelis were doing in support of the Palestinians led South Africa to initiate what has become an extremely important case in the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide and other crimes against humanity. Here's CNN from January of 2024. South Africa accuses Israel of genocide and urges the UN court to halt the Gaza war. South Africa took a major leadership role in being the first country to initiate legal proceedings against Israel. And one might ask why that is. South Africa is not in the proximity of that region. They certainly have a lot of challenges and problems within their country, a lot of political strife to deal with. There's still massive poverty in South Africa. It's a place that I just spent the last 10 days in, so it's one of the reasons why I want to talk about this. But it's always been the case that ever since apartheid fell, the apartheid regime fell, and South Africa became an actual democracy where not just white citizens, but all citizens had the right to vote, and then elected Nelson Mandela, who had spent 27 years in prison as its president. It's always been the case that South Africans have not just been pro-Palestinian or critical of Israel, but vehemently so. Nelson Mandela, once he got out of prison for 27 years, and his imprisonment was supported by the U.S. government. He was put on a terrorist list. He was deemed formally to be a terrorist by the U.S. government. The U.S. government was a close ally of the apartheid regime and government in South Africa, as was Israel. And then, just like the way we celebrated the students of Tahrir Square protesting against Hosni Mubarak, as though it wasn't the case that we supported Hosni Mubarak. When Nelson Mandela was released, we all agreed that he was a heroic figure for having brought down the apartheid regime that the United States played such a major role in supporting. In fact, it was the CIA that helped the apartheid government find where Nelson Mandela was in hiding underground and arrested him and put him in this tiny little prison cell on an island near Cape Town for 27 years. But then when he was released, we all agreed that Nelson Mandela was this heroic figure who was going to be celebrated. And he came to the United States, and a lot of Americans, including members of the media, were very ready to just celebrate Nelson Mandela as a great man, and obviously expected that he would say all the things as a freedom-loving man that the United States government believes and thinks, because the United States government is also so freedom-loving. And they were often given an unpleasant surprise when Nelson Mandela saw many things in the world, including the United States' role in the world, the Israeli role in the world, the Palestinian cause, much, much differently than the United States government saw it. And he was extremely assertive and emphatic and very uncompromising about the way in which he expressed some of those views. Here he is in 1990, Nelson Mandela, speaking at CUNY, the public college in New York.
Our attitude towards any country is determined by the attitude of that country to our struggle. Yasser Arafat, Colonel Gaddafi, Fidel Castro support our struggle to the hilt. They do not support it only in rhetoric. They are placing resources at our disposal for us to win the struggle. That is the position.
Mr. Mandela, as I mentioned to you before the program, we also have some distinguished guests sitting behind us, one of whom, Mr. Henry Sigmund, together with two other Jewish leaders, came to Geneva to visit with you precisely because they were so concerned not only by the kind of thing that you just said before the break with regard to Yasser Arafat, with regard to Libya's Colonel Gaddafi, but also because of the support that you seemed at different times to give to the PLO. I would like to ask Mr. Sigmund to stand now for a moment and pose whatever question he would like directly to you. Mr. Sigmund?
Let me just say that it is kind of remarkable, this Ted Koppel, by the way, for those of you too young to remember him, who was a very prominent journalist on this show called Nightline on ABC News. But Nelson Mandela is imprisoned for 27 years. Both the United States government and the Israeli government are among the greatest allies of the apartheid South African regime. Both countries called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. Both supported his imprisonment. As I said, the CIA helped put him in prison. And then when Nelson Mandela finally gets out of prison and brings democracy to his country, he obviously is somewhat hostile to the governments that helped support apartheid and helped him remain in prison for a good chunk of his life. And I mean a harsh prison. I saw the cell where he was, the prison where he was. It was not in any way a kind of prison that is like a federal prison in the United States. It was a deliberately harsh prison. He was in a tiny little cell designed to humiliate him along with other black leaders. And of course, if he gets out of prison and he supports the Palestinian cause for reasons I want to talk about, substantive reasons, but also because it was the PLO and Cuba and Libya under Muammar Gaddafi who were among the greatest supporters of the anti-apartheid activists like Nelson Mandela. And they're so shocked and offended with this obviously normal and natural and expected position of Nelson Mandela that they actually forced him to have to confront pro-Israel activists who are offended that Nelson Mandela has solidarity with the Palestinian people and actually supported the PLO. Now, one of the interesting things is, although Nelson Mandela is celebrated for this man as this man of peace, because when he was released from prison, he did do something extraordinary, which is he urged the people of South Africa, the majority of people in South Africa who are black and who had been oppressed so brutally for so long, not to seek vengeance through violence, but instead put aside the desire for violence and create a peaceful South African democracy that could thrive instead of being engulfed in civil war. And he joined hands with the white apartheid leader, the last one, President de Klerk, and they both kind of were symbols of peace, and they won the Nobel Peace Prize. So we think of him as a man of peace. But during his activism as an anti-apartheid activist, Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress did in fact use violence on occasion to further their cause of bringing down the apartheid government. And 5 years before he was actually released from prison, and again, not only was it harsh imprisonment, but he was cut off from his family. He was barely able to get visits from his wife, maybe once a year, or his children. They came to him 5 years before he was released from prison and offered him a deal, and they said, we will release you from prison today as long as you vow in writing and then go on television and repeat that under no circumstances is violence justified in the anti-apartheid cause. And he said, I don't accept that deal because I don't agree that violence is never justified. I do think violence against an extremely unjust and repressive government can be justified. That was what the American founders thought. And so Ted Koppel and the United States government were saying, you should condemn the PLO. They use violence against the Israelis. Something we hear now about Hamas and Gaza. And Nelson Mandela was obviously in solidarity with the Palestinians because he too believed that violence against unjust repression by a government denying basic rights was something that was and could be justified. And so here he is coming to the United States, speaking as this honored person, and they have to have Israel supporters, in the words of Ted Koppel, American Jews, there to confront him on his support for the Palestinian cause and his opposition to Israel, which has supported apartheid for decades. Here's what happened.
I think I would be dishonest if I did not express profound disappointment with the answer that Mr. Mandela gave to the previous question, because it suggests a certain degree of amorality.
As far as Yasser Arafat is concerned, I explained to Mr. Sigmund that we identify with the PLO because, just like ourselves, they are fighting for the right of self-determination. If the Jewish leader have any doubts about our stand, I am prepared to address them and to allay their concern, because they are a very important community both in South Africa and, of course, in the States. And I'm prepared to iron out any differences that might exist. But they must know what our stand is. Arafat is a comrade in arms, and we treat him aside. Have many Jews, members of the Jewish community in our struggle, and they have occupied very top positions. But that does not mean to say that the enemies of Israel are our enemies. We refuse to take that position. You can call it being political or a moral question, but for anybody who changes his principles depending on whom he is dealing, that is not a man who can lead a nation.
Now, can you imagine the audacity of that person who stood up and said, I'm deeply disappointed in your answer where you criticized the Israeli government and expressed support for the PLO when the Israeli government was a part of the reason, along with the United States, why apartheid was permitted to lurk and linger in this world for so long? And especially given the support that the PLO gave to the African National Congress and the movement to combat apartheid, and some Israel supporter stands up and says, I'm so disappointed that you don't support Israel, but instead support the Palestinian cause. And as he pointed out correctly, and when we had George Galloway on our show shortly after he won his election to the British Parliament earlier this year, he also pointed out that he's often accused of being an anti-Semite, and yet George Galloway was a major activist in the anti-apartheid movement, going to South Africa and working underground. And what he said was, almost everywhere he went, it was Jews, both in South Africa and other Jews who had come to South Africa who joined in the anti-apartheid movement to combat apartheid. Now, it isn't just Nelson Mandela, but it's also Bishop Desmond Tutu, who also explained why the South African anti-apartheid movement found so much empathy for and similarities with the pro-Palestinian cause as well. Here is Desmond Tutu in the West Bank in August of 2009, where a bunch of Palestinian families were evicted by Israeli settlers. And here's what he had to say about that.
Well, thank you. That it reminds me so much of what used to happen in South Africa, where people were evicted from their homes and their homes were taken over by whites. And you would see someone say, you see that house? That used to be my home, but they are no longer allowed to be there. But the point is, that happened. And now freedom has come to South Africa. And we want to say to you that justice will prevail in your own situation as it has prevailed in other situations, and that you should not give up hope that you will be able to live securely in your homeland.
I mean, beyond the fact that Israel supported the apartheid movement and wanted Nelson Mandela in jail, it really is the case that South Africans back then and to this very day, I saw this and I heard it in so many places, see in the apartheid in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, and see in the repression of the Palestinian people by the Israeli government exactly in their mind what was done to them by the apartheid government. I'm going to show you a couple of things that I saw and heard that made me realize how true that was. But the idea that Israel is an apartheid state and that Palestinians are fighting against the same kind of apartheid the South Africans face is something that not only South African leaders have long maintained, but also many Israeli leaders as well, Israeli officials, Israeli leaders, citizens of Israel. Here in The Guardian, all the way back in 2006, by the reporter Chris McGreal, the article was entitled "Worlds Apart." Quote, Israelis have always been horrified at the idea of parallels between their country, a democracy risen from the ashes of genocide, and the racist system that ruled the old South Africa. Yet even within Israel itself, accusations persist that the web of controls affecting every aspect of Palestinian life bears a disturbing resemblance to apartheid. An Israeli human rights organization has described segregation of West Bank roads by the military as apartheid. Arab Israeli lawyers argue anti-discrimination cases before the Supreme Court by drawing out similarities between some Israeli legislation and white South Africa's oppressive laws. Desmond Tutu, the former Archbishop of Cape Town and chairman of South Africa's Trust and Reconciliation Commission, visited the occupied territories 3 years ago and described what he found as, quote, much like what happened to us black people in South Africa. As far back as 1961, Hendrik Verwoerd, the South African prime minister and architect of the, quote, great apartheid vision, saw a parallel. Quote, the Jews took Israel from the Arabs after the Arabs had lived there for 1,000 years. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state, he said. It is a view that horrifies and infuriates many Israelis. Quote, if we take the magnitude of the injustice done to the Palestinians by the state of Israel, there is a basis for comparison with apartheid, said the former Israeli ambassador to South Africa, Alon Leo. Quote, if we take the magnitude of suffering, we are in the same league. Of course, apartheid was a very different philosophy from what we do, most of which stems from security considerations. But from the point of view of outcome, we are in the same league. That was 20 years ago, where many Israeli officials, along with the white leaders of the South African apartheid government, were seeing this parallel between apartheid in South Africa and what was happening in the Palestinians. Now, even more recently, as things have gotten way worse for the Palestinians in terms of these separate laws and separate living conditions, major Israeli leaders have been saying what the South Africans have long been saying, namely that what we're doing to the Palestinians is the same kind of apartheid. Here in The Guardian from September of 2023, so the month before the October 7th attack by Hamas in Israel, the headline is, Israel is imposing apartheid on Palestinians, says the former chief of the Mossad. Tamir Pardo comments, slammed by ruling Likud party, carry weight because of high regard for intelligence agency in Israel. This was the head of the Mossad, chosen by Benjamin Netanyahu in 2015, who, like other Israeli leaders, including Ehud Barak, the former prime minister and defense minister of Israel, have said that what is happening in Israel is extremely similar, if not identical, to what the South African apartheid government did to black South Africans. Here is Baruch, all the way back in 2010, warning that either we make peace with the Palestinians or we face apartheid. Now, the reason I bring all this up is not because I do think it's so relevant for the leadership role that South Africa has taken, but also given that I've just been in that country for the last 10 days, so much of what I heard and saw made me understand, even on a more visceral level, the reasons why this is how South Africans see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, why they, on a very personal and human level, see in the Palestinians exactly what was done to themselves. If you go to something called the 6th District Museum in Cape Town, which isn't a very well-known museum, but it's sort of this illustrative small museum that commemorates just one small part of apartheid, and it's called the 6th District of Museum because it was in the 6th District. The 6th District of Cape Town had been this thriving town where races of all sorts lived in peace side by side, just like Jews and Muslims and Christians lived in what was then called Palestine, side by side in peace and working with one another and being each other's neighbors. That was what had happened in the 6th District. It was this thriving, robust town that was multiracial. And when the apartheid regime was instituted, certain parts of Cape Town, like Johannesburg, were declared white only or European only, and other parts were declared black only. And usually the black only sections were the poorest parts of what were called shanty towns. And this museum commemorates what was done to the black people of the 6th District in Cape Town in a way that just so visually illustrates the reasons why they see in their own cause what's happening in Palestinians. So here was just a common sign that was in Cape Town right when those mid-20th century apartheid laws were instituted. And there you see, for use by white persons only, these public premises and the amenities thereof have been reserved for the exclusive use of white persons by order of the provincial secretary. And there were all sorts of photos from real time of black people being expelled from these neighborhoods where they were no longer allowed to live, and their houses were being bulldozed, and their all possessions being destroyed. Something we've seen from the West Bank for many, many years, including far more aggressively in the last several years, where Palestinians' homes are just taken from them, they're bulldozed, they're expelled from certain lands that the Jews now want to control, even though international law says they can't. Here's a photo of one of the bulldozers that did that. Here is the entrance to this museum, talking about Pretoria, where every sign says Europeans only. Here is another sign. It just says parking area for 3 taxis for non-whites. It was all just divided this way. And then here's the entrance to that museum, where there's one entrance for whites and one entrance for non-whites. And all these things resonate so obviously for such clear reasons when South Africans look at what is happening in Palestine, where all sorts of areas are reserved for Jews only, roads are reserved for Jews only, to the point where even the former head of the Mossad, appointed in 2015, now says that Israel is an apartheid regime. And just, if you go to South Africa, which again, if you're considering doing it, I highly, highly recommend it. It has everything that you could possibly want there. Natural beauty, an incredibly interesting culture, but also this important political history. You'll really see just on such a visceral level what is happening in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, though we think about it differently in the United States and talk about it differently, is exactly what activists against the apartheid regime experience. And it's why South Africans, not just as a government in the past, but as a government now, and across the political spectrum, everywhere you go, you see Palestinian flags or signs against the Israeli war, and it becomes extremely easy to understand all the different reasons why South Africa has become such a leading voice against the Israeli aggression in the West Bank and Gaza and supportive of the Palestinian cause. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.